Hey Deep Chatters, I'm Leah Morris here with my co-host Jennifer Butler, and this is Deep Chats Podcast, where we have raw discussions about real life. Each week you can expect unfiltered, no BS conversations from the heart about topics that actually might matter to you. We're just a couple of relationship coaches who want to cut through the small talk and dive deeper. So thanks for joining us on this journey, and be sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode.
Hi, Deep Chatters. Welcome back with Leah and I. We're super excited to be here again with you guys. Today, we're going to be talking about resentment and really, how to let go of resentments and how to find your way to the other side of that. I think resentments can really be heavy. They can feel really weighty. And I think they contribute a lot to the common struggle with feeling stuck. So,
Totally.
Yeah. So we thought we'd kind of dive into that today.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because it's kind of this like silent poison that can go unnoticed for a long time. Because sometimes I think we fail to want to process it. It's like this safe blanket. So I think this is going to be a really important episode, but maybe let's start at like, what even is resentment? Like, how does that happen? Like, what is it?
Well, I always feel like resentment is like a stuckness with something that's happened, right? Like almost like a holding on to an emotion, usually anger, about something that's happened in the past. Anywhere that we still feel emotionally charged or emotionally triggered, or, just kind of, just charged or triggered about a person or something that's happened in our lives. I think that is resentment. I don't know.
Yeah, that definitely, that's like what it feels like. I feel like I'm just trying to think about where I feel resentment and why. And I think it's when somebody wrote in, like, is it just an unspoken boundary or
unspoken truth?
Unspoken truth. To me, I think it's more of like, yeah, a boundary can be considered a truth, but I think it's an unspoken boundary has been crossed. Not even unspoken sometimes, just like when there's been an emotional boundary, physical boundary, when there's been some sort of instance, I think, or situation or experience where you feel like something has crossed into the zone of like, this doesn't work for me. And whether the person knowingly has done that to you or not communicating that it has happened sort of creates this feeling of resentment for me. Like it's a digging in of like disrespect, devaluing, minimizing, and just sort of holding on to that feeling rather than expressing it and saying like, hey, I don't like what you did there, or hey, I don't like how you talk to me, or hey, I don't like this situation. It's like a holding on to that crossing of a boundary. At least that's how I feel.
Yeah, I think the key is the holding on, because it doesn't become a resentment until you don't speak about it, right? Resentment in and of itself means that it's festered, right? If somebody like does something, that doesn't feel good for us, and then you communicate it or you address it, right? Like you're still angry. You might feel angry in the moment, or you might feel disrespected, or you might feel like somebody's crossed a boundary, but I don't think it'll become a resentment until there's time. So it almost has to be like the action and time mixed together without you expressing yourself.
Absolutely.
in some way.
Absolutely. I like that distinction. And I think also sometimes we can resent people and not even realize why, because we are holding on to resentment from other experiences. Like I find whenever I'm automatically irritated with someone, or I automatically am like, I don't like that person. And there's like that little twinge of resentment for some reason. There's really no reason why I should feel that way, but it's because they remind me of somebody, or they remind me of a situation where I've held on to that. And I've resented, something that's happened and I've not expressed it. And so then it begins to like sort of bleed into other relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the work that I do, like, even just how I've been trained by Catherine, we see resentment as a block to love, right? So it's like, if you do have resentments that you need to work through, it's one of the blocks for calling love into your life, or for, consciously connecting with yourself, or, the work that I do with couples, with women who are transitioning out of a relationship, right? It's like, there's so much resentment. And if we don't process that, if we don't heal those resentments, it actually stands in the way of us truly being able to fully express and, love and be loved.
Yeah. That's really important to realize too, is like, it is a block to love. But I think also there's a reason why we hold on to these things. There's a reason why we allow that wound to stay open and for it to fester. And like, we're getting something out of that. Like there's a reward there for sure. That's why people do it. So then my question, like, why do we do that? Why do we hold on?
I mean, I believe we hold on because it's easier to be mad at somebody else than it is to be mad at ourselves, right? It's easier for me to say, I'm mad at him because he abandoned me and he walked away and he left and it's all him. And I can just be pissed off and put all of that on somebody else, because that is way easier than going, he might have left, but I abandoned myself way before he ever did. And I left myself, and I never stood up for my feelings or shared my heart or any of that. And for me to look at myself and say, wow, it's really me. Like, I need to forgive myself. That's harder, much harder.
Yeah. Wow. There's almost like a layer of self-resentment that comes into play, that it's like, maybe if I resent someone else, maybe if I hold on to that hatred of them, then I don't have to work through the hate that I am feeling for myself.
Yeah.
And I think in relationships, that's like in romantic relationships, it's really easy to like right away, like hold on to, they're the bad guy.
Yeah.
I'm a victim. How dare you hurt me? I'll never forgive you for this.
Yeah.
It's way easier to blame others. And I think to a certain extent, it's fair to say it took two, but it's never fair to say it was just you. I think that there's, like, you and I have talked about in other episodes, that there's always a choice there. And so why did I choose that for myself?
Yeah.
And the thing about resentment is, like, we are holding on to it, right? So there's been time that has passed. And so then what it comes down to is, not only did I choose that person, I maybe chose to stay with them after the pain was inflicted. I chose to take them back. I chose to overlook it. I chose to not say how I was feeling. Which then is a direct crossing of boundaries on the self.
Right. Exactly. I mean, I know that I can say, like, because when I went through my divorce, I was in that place for far longer than I wish I ever would have been.
Mm-hmm.
And far longer than, quite honestly, is necessary. It's not necessary at all. But I was in that place for a long time of feeling very resentful. And, you know, when I kind of look back and wonder around what was I getting from it, the other thing I was getting from it is when you're in a relationship with somebody and then it's over, sometimes having anger is better than having nothing, right? It's like, at least if you're pissed, at least if you're angry, you're still in relationship with that person, right? You still have this connection of anger and resentment and hurt and all of that. But once you let that go, then you have to face the void of, we're done, right? And so I think that's another reason we hold on to the anger, is it keeps us tied and tethered to that other human.
Yeah, I think, you know, they say the opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy.
We love the train.
I know. But yeah, and it's a scary place to be in that void.
Yeah. Well, because you have to face yourself, right?
Yeah, because you're the only one left.
Yeah.
Oof. God, that's so true. I also think, you know, because I was the same exact way when I got my divorce for a long time. I still feel it pop up on occasion. But it was something that I held on to very closely, because that anger and resentment, because in a way I felt like I needed it to stay safe and to never make the mistake again. Like, I felt like it was this rope of that sort of like pulled me out. Like, oh, you're angry. Oh, remember how terrible this was. And it pulled me out, but I was still holding on to it even after I was out of the water, you know?
Yeah.
But then it just tethers you to that experience still. And it's like, you have to let go in order to really like move on with your life. And for a long time, I moved on in so many different ways, but that tethering of anger and resentment, still, you can feel that in your body. Like you said in the beginning, like you can, like, it's a somatic experience. You can feel that tether. And for some reason, that was one of the hardest things for me to let go of, I think, because I was like, well, if I don't have this anger, one, I'm going to have to face myself more fully. True. But two, what's going to, like, will I forget that this ever happened and find myself in this terrible situation again? Right. I didn't trust myself enough to not have that anger be a life support for me. And so it was almost learning to trust that I could let go and still not fall back in.
I think that's so huge, the trusting yourself. I think because you're exactly what you're saying, you're afraid of letting that happen again. And so it really then it has to come down to, okay, well then how do I relearn how to trust myself? And that is through, you know, looking at yourself and seeing where it is that you showed up that created the situation in the first place, right? Because that's the lack of trust for yourself. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, well, I didn't listen to the red flags, right? I didn't listen to my intuition. I didn't ever share the way I felt. I overcompensated and overgave. Like, whatever your list is, like when you're finally looking at yourself and saying, okay, this is how I helped to create this in the first place. I think that's what you're afraid of, is like, what if you do that again, right? But if you can let go of the resentment and start to like look at yourself and say, okay, where did I give my power away? Oh, I never spoke up for myself. okay, well, what skills do I now need to learn so that I learn how to speak up for myself? Right. And that's how you learn how to trust yourself, right? Like you learn how to trust yourself by learning those new skills and showing up in a way that creates something other than what you had in the past.
Practice.
Practice. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it's skills, you know, people take for granted, I think, that like we're supposed to just know how to say how we feel. We're supposed to just know how to set boundaries. You know, like for most of us, we never learned that.
No.
Ever. You know,
Yeah.
I never learned how to set boundaries in my when I was growing up. I never learned, you know, how to express and honor my feelings and needs. Like not at all. Yeah. So those are skills that I had to learn as an adult.
Yeah, I always say boundaries are a learned skill. And that's like one of the things, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, that you have to teach people and have role playing and like, hey, let's practice what it feels like to tell me no, you know, and it's so uncomfortable for people. And I know with me, like you need to practice. It's so helpful because it is not something we're born with knowing how to do. And I think there's actually this book that it's like so old school. It's called When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. Yeah. And it was written in like 1975 or something like that. But it's really great because it gives all these different scenarios of instances where people are abandoning themselves and what they could have done better and giving like a script for that. But, you know, I guess if we're to like rewind back to how we were raised, you know, that we were never taught these certain things. I wanted to touch a little bit on what do you do with resentment of a parent? Yeah. You know, what do you do? Somebody wrote in, you know, how do you process resentment with a narcissistic or emotionally unavailable parent? Because it's one thing to be an adult and say, you know, I chose that romantic relationship. And so in a way, like now I have to face myself. And then you can process that. How do you process situations that you didn't necessarily choose with like a parental relationship?
I mean, I always say it's never a child's fault, right? I think a lot of times we take the blame. It must have been my fault. Like children just do make it about themselves, right? But when you're processing it when you're older, you know, it's never your fault. It's never something you chose, right? It happened. It's heartbreaking. And you have to mourn that. You have to grieve that fully. You have to grieve what you didn't have, you know, and what you went through. And then you have to be willing to look and see how you're keeping that alive. You know, you didn't choose it then, but how are you still living that story, right? How are you still, you know, if we're talking about, I think the person asked about a narcissistic unavailable parent, you know, that wasn't of her asking, right? But I imagine that in order to survive as a child, she created some sort of story and came up with a ton of really creative and brilliant survival skills to get through it. But as an adult, I imagine those skills don't really work anymore and are not conducive to creating a really close and intimate and connected relationship, right? And so then it's like, okay, how am I continuing to give my power to this past experience? And how can I, you know, shift out of that and, you know, learn the skills I need to learn so I can create something different?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all had, I don't know if I've ever met anyone who's like, oh, I had the most emotionally healthy, perfect childhood. And, you know, my parents got everything right. And there's nothing, you know, that I would have changed ever. I don't know if I've met anyone like that. I know that, we all have our cross to bear, so to speak. And it's easy, once again, to point the blame.
It's just funny. I always joke with my son, I'm always like, well, we'll see when you're in therapy in 20 years how I did, because either you're going to be in therapy because I messed up or because I did it too perfect. So, right? Like either way, we'll figure it out, right? Because none of us, you can't get it, it's like you just try your best.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all have this idea of, so what, I was listening to something the other day, and what the narcissistic personality does, and what a lot of times when we have like a narcissistic parent or emotionally unavailable parent, we begin to carry on those narcissistic perceptions of the world, even though it's not necessarily in our personality. We understand things similarly to the way our parents brought us up. So if we had a narcissistic parent, what the narcissistic personality will do is they'll actually seek perfection in everyone else. They want there to be a perfect interaction, according to them, from everyone they meet. And if it's not perfect, there's a sort of a withdrawing or a withholding of feelings or a manipulation to get it to be perfect. And it becomes this like really toxic power struggle in a way. And it's because they themselves were raised in a situation where they were sort of not accepted for who they were either. So I think, that story that we create in our heads of, I'm never gonna be good enough, maybe. And what I have to say doesn't matter. We draw in partners who we want their interaction with us to be perfect and healing, and for them to give us permission to be whole, because we were never given that when we were younger. And so it's important to pay attention to those stories and how we're like keeping them alive. But also it's hard to look at all of our failed relationships and say like, well, if only mom or dad were not such a narcissist, if only mom and dad treated me in a way that I felt more heard and more seen and more loved, if only this, if only that. And that resentment is hard. It's a hard one to let go of. And I think maybe there's a piece of this that like, maybe there will never be a full letting go. But more of a forgiveness and compassion. I think that's where to begin with this. Like maybe you're not ready to let go of, being put in that situation that you had no control over. It just feels like a total violation for a child. And, as an adult looking back on your childhood, like, how could you have done that to me? And maybe you're not ready to let go of that. But I think looking at it from a place of they were navigating the world and navigating parenting in the best way that they could, and the only way that they understood how, because of the way they were raised too. Sort of having compassion at the very least for that experience of being an adult and not knowing how to even manage their emotions, let alone the emotions of a child. I don't know if that all makes sense, but.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, when we talk about letting go, I think we sometimes expect that we're just going to like have this light bulb moment where we forgive and let go, right? It's not that, forgiveness is a daily practice. It's waking up every day saying, I choose not to live in the anger. I choose not to live in the resentment. And I choose to find forgiveness and practice forgiveness each and every day. And I think a big piece of that, though, is how do you take back your power? I think at the end of the day, wherever you're bleeding power, and if it's as a result of how you've grown up, like whatever your that source of that is, I think it's a journey of really discovering, okay, well, this is where I'm still bleeding my power. This is where I'm still abandoning myself. This is where I'm still, not living in integrity or being disloyal to my heart. Right. And finding those spots and learning how to then show up in a different way. Right. Because I don't know. I mean, as somebody, I feel so, I guess, grateful, because as somebody who was so resentful, like took things so personally, like I was so raw and felt so, like friends would say something and I would automatically think it was about me. It was all this resentment that had been built up. Right. And that heavy heart. And I remember how painful it was. And I've done a lot of work. Right. And, I walk the walk, right? Like I walk, I walk my talk or whatever that is. Right. Like, because I believe in what I teach, and I don't feel resentment anymore, like at all. And I do use it as a guidepost when it pokes in. Right. And so, I have that tumultuous relationship with my mom, and a lot of really unnecessary things as a child that I navigated through. Right. And was not shielded from. And, I'll use those moments when I start to feel any pang of like charge around her to really reflect on myself and be like, okay, what's going on? What am I so upset about right here? And it might be something like, I might tune in and be like, I'm mad because she's not listening to me, right? Here we are again, she's not listening. And so then I'll use that as okay, where am I not listening to myself? Right? Like, where am I not using my voice? Where am I not being heard? Because I need to stop bleeding that power. She can't do that for me. Right? And so if I can step into that and say lovingly, hey, Mom, you're not listening to me. And it's really hard for me to have this conversation with you if you're not going to hear me. Right? I don't feel that anymore then. I'm in my power. And then it becomes like a healing moment for me, hopefully for her. I don't know. I can't control her, but I can heal me. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. No, I think it's important because like that's your experience. And it's funny because I feel like with my mom, when I think of resentment, it's the women in my life that come up. It's my stepmom, my ex-stepmom, and my mother. And so I can relate to what you're saying as far as like getting that pang of like right away you're like irritated or you're mad or you're set off, and the fuse is so short. And this is actually something I've been working on just this past year, actually. And I had the incredible opportunity to actually have a conversation with my mom about my resentment towards her. And it was a little rocky at first, because it was kind of like a little bit of a volcano that I'd been holding on to for 33 years of my life. And So when it came out, I had an expectation of how I wanted her to receive me. And when it didn't turn out that way at first, when it became about her again, I had to steer it back and say, like, you know, really clearly, like, I need you to hear me right now. Mm-hmm. And so it is like this practice and consistent showing up. And it began with that moment for me. And since then, you know, I voiced to her, hey, like, this is just sort of, now that I've expressed myself to you doesn't mean I'm not angry anymore. It kind of means that now I can be fully angry. Right. And she said, yeah, I get it. You've just opened the jar. We've just opened the jar. And I said, thanks for understanding, you know, but I'm not going to want to answer all your calls for a while. I'm not going to want to, like, I need time to process all of this. But I think that, like, the beginning of that is the acknowledgement and saying out loud, I am angry. And now I'm going to begin to practice processing that anger. Instead of denying your anger, instead of denying the pain, acknowledging it. And maybe you never get a chance to acknowledge it to the parent, but at least acknowledging it to yourself, to your therapist, to your friends. And then you can begin to sort of let that wound heal on its own. Don't push down the anger whenever it shows up. I think, you know, choose to say, like, that's there. Okay, that's still there. And it's going to continue to process. I don't need to act in that way of resentment anymore. I'm letting myself heal in a healthy way. I was going to say something else, but I can't remember right now, but I think it's a lifelong thing. And I'm like making all kinds of book recommendations today, because this is actually a big one, like parental resentment for me. There's this book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. And it's really short and simple to understand, but it's amazing because it just helps you to identify, this is what happened. This wasn't healthy. This wasn't okay. And in that identification, it helps you to acknowledge and say, like, oh, that's why I feel resentment. That's why I'm angry. That was a hurtful thing that happened. And it's just a really catalyzing way to process, to begin the process of moving through resentment.
Well, there's something so powerful about like normalizing something or giving something a name, right? Like, there's so many things that I've felt or experienced that I thought were like unique to me, or didn't make sense, or thought, like, I was like, gosh, I'm crazy to feel this way. And then I'll read something and it's like, oh, well, if, you know, do you A, B, and C? And it's like, oh my gosh, that's actually a thing. Like, it's normal. Like, it's, there's a reason for that, right? Because then you can start to like, then you can start to really kind of see it for what it is. It's almost like, is it DBT, diabolical therapy, whatever, I can't remember the name of it, but and it's radical surrender, right? Like that's kind of like the foundation of that therapy, is this practice of radically surrendering, right? Like, whatever is happening in your life, a lot of times if it doesn't feel good, we fight against it, right? If we're ill, we fight against it. If we're going through a breakup, we push, we resist. And if we can just radically surrender to what is. Lady Gaga, I was privileged to see her live with Oprah, and she talked about radical surrender because she has a nerve disorder. So she's in pain all the time. And I can't even imagine what that's like, to like be in excruciating physical pain most of your life. And to not want to fight against that, right? To not constantly be pushing up against that. And so she talks about how much health she gained when she started to practice this radical surrender of just, this is it. I am in pain, right? I can't change that. This is what I have. This is what it is. And now what steps or what can I do from here, right? Because then you can, once you accept where you are, then you can start to plan a route forward, right? But you can't do that until you really are like, okay, here's where I am.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like the 12-step program in a way. Like first acknowledging the current situation. Okay, here we are. I wasn't given all the cards that I wish I was given as a child. My parent didn't get it perfectly, X, Y, and Z. Now what?
Right.
Why give that so much power for the rest of your life?
Right.
Yes, it did hold a lot of power over you for a long time, maybe, but it doesn't always need to. And what can you give that power to instead? Yourself, your own choices from there on out, or wherever you choose to sort of like navigate from. But I think taking that power away from the ideal way that you wish it would have been, and that you wish someone else would have been, and saying the power is in what I am and what I can be from here on out. But yes.
Well, and grieving that, I think grieving it, right? Like,
yeah,
you have to grieve what you wish you had or what you'd never had.
Yeah.
I remember that moment. I was probably in my early 20s, and somebody said to me, you're never going to have the relationship with your mom that you wish you had, right? It's not possible. Like the image that you have in your head isn't going to happen. So you can keep holding on to that image and be so angry your whole life that you're never going to have that. Or you can figure out a way to grieve it and mourn it, and then accept the relationship that you do have, and then make the best of that, right? See what you can have with that relationship, because it's like, and so, and I'll never forget that. And it took me a long time to grieve it. But I did have to grieve it. I did have to be pissed about it. I did have to, feel hopelessness. I did, the 5 stages of grief. I think I was listening to David Kessler talk about how we go through the 5 stages of grief with any loss, whether it's a death, a divorce, or a flat tire on the way to an interview, right? We get pissed, we start bargaining, we get really hopeless, right? Like we go through all of the steps. And so I had to go through all those steps. And then I was left with the relationship that I do have, the mother that I do have, the mother that I believe may not be the ideal that I wish I had, but the mother that I needed in order to be who I am. And so then I was able to create something of value, right? Instead of like just being so upset about what I didn't get.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine like being a mom and having your kids say, I wish you would have been this way instead, and being like, I don't know what to do about that. I'm a human being, I'm imperfect. But yeah, the grief of a ideal, and the grief of like losing even like a feeling like you've lost a chance at something. That's real for sure. I mean, yeah, you talk about like flat tires, relationships, a loved one. It's, if you get attached enough to something and you have to let it go, you're going to end up feeling that grief for sure.
Absolutely.
So, and the ultimate place that you hope to arrive at in that grief process is acceptance.
Yeah. If you process it, if you're willing to process it, right?
Right. And then the acceptance, because I think the grief and resentment go hand in hand, but the acceptance of the loss of that, the acceptance of, you know, the anger that was there, the hurt, acknowledging that, the naming of it, the identifying of it, then the process begins, and the practice of compassion and forgiveness and choosing not from that story anymore.
Yeah.
Is the ultimate way that we can process resentment. It's no fun carrying that around.
Yes. So David Kessler, now I think it's out, I'm not sure, but has written the sixth stage of grief. So he's come up with the sixth stage now, and it's making meaning. It's more than just the acceptance, right? After that is, what is the meaning you will make of this? Because it really is in our power to make the meaning. I think sometimes we're like, we'll be like, oh, there has to be a reason, right? And we look for that reason outside of ourselves. We wait for some moment when it's all going to just make sense, right? It's not that. It's, what meaning will you make of this? Because it's in your power to decide, well, is this divorce going to, the meaning I'm going to make is that I, gave away 20 years of my life and I wasted my time and I wasted my best years? Or is it going to be the meaning that, I discovered my deepest wounds, I healed them, I overcame, I healed my relationships, and I lived this joyful existence where I inspire people? Like, same story, but it's your decision as to what meaning will you make.
Yeah. I love that. I'm just thinking, like, what was the meaning of mine? And I think that's just such a beautiful way to look at things. I think that for me, like, I picture the closing of every door, that every challenge, everything that sort of pushes you away and pushes you over and down. It's like this darkness pushing you towards light, and pushing you towards more love and more beauty and more peace. We sort of begin there as children. And I think the meaning of all of these hardships is that we're shedding and we're getting back to that purity, that love, and that light. At least that's the meaning that I want to choose to put in there.
Yeah. No, I know it's a beautiful, I want to read the book because it's, I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I don't think meaning is not seen as a necessary thing to put into grief or into experiences that are difficult. It's not seen as that, but I think the people who can process it the best are the ones who do apply that.
Well, I think that's what he's saying, is it is necessary for processed grief. If you're going to fully process your grief and not allow yourself to get stuck in the grief, whether it's the anger, the resentment, whatever that is, if you're not going to just end up stuck there and you're going to fully process, I think that's what he is saying, is that that's kind of that last step, is the meaning that you're going to make of it.
I love that. Well, this feels good. I'm so glad we talked about this, because I can feel like, even talking about our parents, like there's a lot of people out there who can relate. I loved all the questions that we got from people this time.
Yeah, you guys are
really
awesome.
Yeah, it's so important that we visit this stuff together. There's just so many connective things that we can get from these conversations. when we actually give ourselves permission to bring them up and acknowledge them and speak on them. So thank you all for talking to us and for letting us know. We want to, continue these conversations. And I think if you know anyone who is struggling with resentment, or you can feel the weight of that anger in them, and it's not serving them, please share this episode with them. Maybe there's something that they've been waiting to hear that they'll find in this episode. All right, Deep Chatters, until next time, we're signing off. Thank you so much again. Have a beautiful day.
Bye, Deep Chatters.
To all you Deep Chatters out there, Leah and I want to thank you so much for listening. This is a podcast that's all about connection, so we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on Instagram at Deep Chats Podcast. And if you haven't already, please go to iTunes to rate and review us. Every review helps other Deep Chatters just like you be able to find this podcast.